We've got a lot of facts, a lot of stories, that will make this inquiry really powerful. It gives us the opportunity to know where we're actually sitting. Are we being paid our worth? I think it's crucial now because of the COVID-19 lockdown. A lot of our Pacific community are the frontline workers. We're the cleaners, we're the ones working in the factories, we're the ones that will take on those hard jobs. And I think it's about time that as Pacific people that we're listened to, we've got that voice. I think the systemic changes is once the report is released, it will make our government stop and listen, that it starts from the government. They set policy and legislation, and then it will filter down to our human relations policy, and then hopefully everything else will be fixed.
I think without pay transparency, it's a bit like fighting fog. You're trying to validate to yourself and to others that this problem exists. With a great deal of effort, it is possible to find information to back up your argument, but I think if we had pay transparency in place, then it would be a much easier process. And that process to me is one that's very necessary. I think we need to be working a lot harder on creating a fair and equitable society. New Zealanders want to live in an open, honest, fair society. Our values and the way that we live tends to embody that, and I think if we don't have pay transparency, then we're failing to live up to the values that we claim to live by. We need people to step up, particularly in business, and become leaders. Don't wait for someone else to do it yourself, because I can assure you it will only benefit your business and benefit you and benefit the people who work for you. And I think New Zealand, as a small country, has the opportunity to be a world leader. We need someone to step up and progress this issue, and who better than New Zealand? We already have the history there. Look at what we've already achieved. We're letting our forebears down by not actually doing something about this and doing it now. Let's get on with it.
I think it's necessary to address racial discrimination, the Pacific pay gap, or a lack of opportunities, because it's all about fairness and decency. So for Pacific people, it's about being afforded the same opportunities as anyone else might have in the same situation. So it's being paid the same as anyone else, it's being treated as decently as anyone else, it's having access to the same pathways to achievement and progression as anyone else might have. In terms of systemic change, there's a lot of talk around pay transparency, and that is something that could be looked at. I also know there's a lot of work being done in the background by groups like the CTUs, Komiti Pasifika. They should be supported, and I encourage any member of the Pacific community to get involved in that space, because it's when we act and speak out collectively that often results come. In terms of other changes in the systems, I think representation and inclusion is important. It's about empowering that diversity so that they're at the table when it comes to decision making, when it comes to problem solving, so their pathways of progression need to lead to that. I know our Pacific people, I know from the experience of my dad's life and my family around us, that there's this innate sense of duty to serve our communities, which is great. But coupled with that, there's this often sense of sacrifice where we do things for our church, for our family, for our social circles, and we don't think about our personal well-being. That's admirable and noble, but in the workplace, we deserve better. We deserve to be paid for the work we do. We deserve to be paid as much as the person next to us. So get involved, because you deserve to be paid what you're worth.
People that I know in the trans community have been, their struggle is not necessarily with pay equity or pay transparency. Having a job, being able to have the opportunity to work. I think it's unconscious bias is very powerful. People want to employ people who think like them, who look like them, who will reflect their values. If you bring diversity into the workplace, suddenly people can see their values being challenged. I've been in the same pay grade for 15 years before I applied for progression. I wanted to just make sure I was competent before I applied. And a lot of the research shows that men will apply because they're confident, whereas women will apply when they're competent, when they feel competent. So that tends to delay women's application for progression. Pay transparency is about visibility, being able to be visibly who I am, being able to be trans, and be able to see that I'm not being disadvantaged because I'm trans, that my pay is equivalent to the people around me who have the same set of skills and knowledge. I don't need to know an individual's pay, but I certainly need to know that people on my grade, what their pay scales are, what the range is. I kind of know where I can place myself in terms of my career. I think pay transparency is really important because it makes it visible. Straight away there's an inequity developing into the system very quickly, and you can work to correct it. Is there parity? Is there equality? Is there equity? By making it visible, we allow people to identify areas where there's maybe an unconscious bias or a deep discrimination that's been taking place for a long time, that allows it to be identified and rectified. Having pay transparency is providing people with more information so that they can make better decisions about what they need to do with their lives, whether they can apply for progression or whether they need to maybe change jobs or shift somewhere else, that they're making informed decisions because they have access to the information. So I want that power to be everyone to have that access to the information because I know it will empower them. Everyone has the right to fulfilling and sustain work, and to have to know how their pay fits into the pay scales of those who have similar skills and experience, and to how what they need to do to progress in their career. There's so many people out there being disadvantaged now, so women, the trans community, people of colour, that if you were open about transparency and say, I'm committed to equity and parity, you're going to attract a whole lot of good people into your organisation. So by being transparent, you're actually going to get a competitive advantage. You're not going to lose your competitive advantage.
I support the Human Rights Commission campaign for pay transparency because it's the right thing to do. It's actually something that's quite overdue, and everybody, you know, deserves a fair deal. And so there's that systemic racism. There are varying moments where it's quite blatant, and then there's subtle forms, like for instance, overseeing somebody who's more than capable, more than experienced for a promotion. Why are they still stuck in a certain position and not given the opportunity? Whereas somebody else will come in and boom, straight away, you know, they're in and they're paid more, or their conditions are much better. So when Pacifica people know that they're not being paid that well, if they're not ready to move, they will, to survive, to support the family, find another job, pick up the extra overtime shifts. And then there's also, they're not there to be there with their children, so the children don't have someone to oversee their homework or oversee what they're up to. It's a major, major impact. The life is different. I'm very pro pay transparency in the workplace, and I know it does exist. I know some organisations, they do actually provide that information. And everybody, even Stevens, they start here. If you have pay transparency, and people will have an understanding of what they need to do to advance or to completely maybe switch and go elsewhere. We should actually be encouraging our government, our organisations, everybody to actually sign the petition, like I've signed the petition, because it's the right thing to do. And it's not only just for us, it's for future generations as well.
So since we started the campaign, you know, we've had a number of unions come out and add their voice. We've heard stories from women, from caregivers, from directors. We confronted the Prime Minister with the question, and she provided her, you know, her verbal support.
On pay transparency, I do think that we should look at it, and we are. Julianne Genter's been looking at this issue for a while. We're looking at the impact it's had internationally, because actually I think people agree we need to deal with our gender pay gap. It's
kind of lifted the lid and enabled people to come out and talk about, you know, how important pay transparency is. I didn't realise just how uncomfortable people are about talking about money. It's like the last taboo, you know. But actually by talking about money, we can talk about money that you should have, that you don't have. In a way it's empowered, you know, everybody. But certainly for women in terms of progressing, And certainly for people of colour who we know, at the bottom of the income scale, to be equipped with information has made them feel empowered, but also to understand that they have a right. And actually the issues around equity and fairness and transparency is what is attracting talent now to companies. If you're being really secretive about this stuff, you're going to miss out. So if you want to attract talent, top talent, positive attitudes from people and loyalty from your workforce, be transparent about how much you're going to pay them. Be transparent about what they need to do to progress. Thank you to our key allies, our union partners, our women's groups who have been so strong, to our group of corporates who have come on board with the intention to progress pay transparency. Because you have lifted your voice, people have heard. We really want to invite everybody to come on board, sign it, and then we're going to hand this over to Parliament and over to government. Your voice is your power. Your power, alongside our advocacy, will lift this issue and give it urgency in the eyes of government. Without your voice, this is not going to go anywhere. So please come and join us.
O te whaatolo whātu ina pe I mana mamalu, we're feeling nei tū la, malo level sui for tēnā koutou rangatira mā. Warm Pacific greetings to each of you on behalf of the Equal Employment Opportunities Commissioner, Saunoamaali'i Dr. Karanina Sumeo, and to Te Kāhui Tika Tangata, the New Zealand Human Rights Commission. I welcome you to our webinar today, and thanks for taking time out of your lunch and day to join us. By the way, you're all looking very amazing today, so thank you for bringing your passionate support, but also your attractiveness as well. Fire emojis all around. It's a really exciting time for the Pacific Pay Gap Inquiry and campaign, because today we're launching an open letter to the government to urgently introduce pay transparency legislation. And in today's webinar, you'll hear from the Commissioner, as well as our esteemed panelists, Agnes, Naera, Lynette Reid, Nina Santos, Fuimaono, Jennifer, Laulala, and who all represent different settings and perspectives from across business, unions, and community of why this is urgent and imperative that this legislation must proceed. They will all speak individually, and then we'll have a Q&A who was convened by the Commissioner. Before I hand over to Saunoamaali'i, two things. First, I wish to give the apologies from Dave Leitele, the founder of Butterbean Motivation Program. He had a last-minute engagement that clashed with today, but he's in full support of our call. And secondly, I'll start off with a karakia that we use in our mahi here at Human Rights Commission. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mākina kina ki uta, kia mātaratara ki tai. Ehi ake ana atakura, he hio, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, Tihei Modi Order. It's now my honour to introduce Saunoamaali'i, Dr. Karanina Sumeo, who has dedicated her tenure and applied astute leadership to really progress this issue from one that was not on the public consciousness a few short years ago to one where people understand and recognise that the Pacific pay gap and ethnic pay gap indeed does exist. So I'd like to hand over now to the Commissioner. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou, Nizambol Binaka, Namaste, Whakalofa Lahayatu, Kia orana, halo, haloketa, warm Pacific greetings. And it's great to see you all. Thank you for making the time to be with us. And I want to thank our esteemed panelists for also taking the time to add their voices today to encourage us to go and spread the word about this open letter. Whaftai lava whamasanga for your words so open and for calming us for our webinar today. The purpose ultimately for pay transparency is to have no hungry children in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Is to have nobody homeless in Aotearoa, New Zealand. To achieve equal employment opportunities for everybody. That is a right that belongs to everybody. To have an adequate standard of living for every single person, including our children in Aotearoa, New Zealand, for fairness and decency. That is the ultimate vision. And pay transparency is one of the key mechanisms that we would like government to act on in this term. Don't leave it again. People have been waiting for generations for equality and equity and freedom from discrimination. There's no need to leave it to someone else to take responsibility for making that happen. We have a moment in time, and we've got communities who are calling for pay transparency. We've got businesses, we've got unions, of course, who have been calling for many, many years for pay transparency, so that our workers can feel confident that when they're giving their talent, their loyalty to our businesses, that in return, they are guaranteed fairness and equality and equal opportunity to progress. So pay transparency. You know, we've had the Equal Pay Act, you know, since 1972, and we don't have equal pay. We've had the Human Rights Act since 1993 that actually makes it unlawful to discriminate against anyone in terms of pay and benefits from their work when you're doing the same work, you know, equal pay for work of equal value. But that's not the reality for so many people. So what we're basically saying is, while we have all these pieces of legislation, while we have goodwill, it's not enough. Because the Pacific Pay Gap Inquiry has shown that even when you factor in education and occupational choice, it doesn't explain the difference in pay. For men, over 70% of the difference in pay cannot be explained by those factors. For Pacific women, over 60% cannot be explained by education and occupational choice. We've got a problem and we need to face it. And as my call out this morning on RNZ, I said, it's time for us to turn on the lights. Turn on the lights so we can see through the dark and we can see who's at the table and who isn't and who's missing out. And it's really important that we confront this as a nation. And I want to commend and thank all of our unions, all of our businesses, from large businesses to small businesses, all of our women, all of our young people, everyone who has lent their voice to lobby for pay transparency. And I am appealing to our government in the spirit of service that you talk about frequently. Here's an opportunity for you to enable the legislation for pay transparency to become a reality in your term, in your time, in our time. So I'll stop talking from here, Andre, but that is the vision for pay transparency ultimately. And I look forward to our webinar, Whaftai lava.
Saunoamaali'i. You know, the call there is no longer any delay. Let's do this as soon as possible. And we will give you the opportunity to do that actually at the end of the seminar today, or the webinar rather, that we will send you a link to our open letter that's already live now. So please, your support is appreciated, and let's put necessary pressure and give government a compelling reason to introduce this legislation, which all the research has already been done for. We're now going to start off with one of our first panelists today, and we're going to soon hand over to Agnes Naera. And Agnes is of Ngā Puhi and Ngāti Raukawa descent, and stepped into the role of the CE role of Global Women in 2020. And she sees the opportunity to utilise the pandemic disruption to navigate the present and creating the way forward for global women to lead and serve a more equitable Aotearoa. Agnes has held several leadership roles in tertiary educations and also holds a number of board roles. I'll now hand over to you, Agnes.
Kia ora koutou katoa. It's lovely to be here. Before I start, first of all, Andre, I want to acknowledge you and the team. I know what it takes to pull these together and stand up, and it's been I've learned a lot, and we're going to borrow some of your really kind of efficient and really kind of smart ways that you've stood this up. And the fact that we moved it from live to online very easily. So mihi to you and to your team. Amazing. Thank you. To you, Karanina, I remember having that first conversation a couple of years ago, and not surprised at your tenacity to kind of keep going. And so I acknowledge the work that you, your organisation, but particularly you, all of those that hold different places know what it takes. And it's much more than resilience to stand up every day. And we know what good can look like for sure. So I just want to acknowledge you and the role that you've played in bringing us where we are today. And look, I watched the video that you had pre this. I just wanted to pick up again on a couple of things that resonated or came out. That idea that, why wouldn't New Zealand lead this? Why can't we be the world-class leader? And we should be, so I want to acknowledge that. I also wanted to acknowledge the kōrero around that, particularly for Pacifica and probably for Māori, that innate sense of duty, but we should be paid what we are worth. And that kōrero around pay transparency is about being visible. And we talk about this thing about bringing your whole self and being visible, and that's what pay transparency is going to do, because we'll know what we're worth. So I acknowledge that kōrero. From that. And the idea about, it's quite challenging for us to talk about money in some of our cultural settings, but that idea that it does empower us and we have a right to have that information and understand what a career progression looks like for us. And then I suppose finally that idea about we need to stop talking about it and we need to do something about it. Look, I just wanted to share a little bit in terms of, so for those that do know or don't know, Global Women have kind of 3 streams of work or 4 streams of work. One of them is around our corporate and our government partners, around our membership, around women in leadership and advocacy. So I want to share a little bit of my observations and my learnings as a chief executive as we work across those groupings of people. But I also want to make, before I start, the other thing I wanted to do, I wanted to mihi to David. I was thinking when I was following him, it's like, God, that's going to be a hard act to follow, but I did want to follow him. So I acknowledge all the hard work that he's doing in the community, and look forward to kind of, talking with him at another time. So sorry, that was the last. But look, the other thing to kind of note, of course, is the democratization of information means that people do have access to what other people are on, and it mightn't be in their organisation, and that sharing of information or that access to that information is only going to grow. So it's going to become more transparent for organisations or for individuals, at least, to understand their value and their worth. So that's going to continue to kind of grow. So look, my observation is pay transparency is a journey, and for organisations, it really starts about that why. And Karanina shared a little bit about, why you would do that. The videos kind of did. But that's where we kind of, so it's a journey that we need to start, and we should have started for sure. That's clear. But it is a journey. It's not something, and it's interesting when I think about some of the work we've done even around the treaty, and I underestimated the fear that people had. And I think some of that is here too. And we know, that what it does, it builds, pay transparency will build a trusted environment, increases morale, engagement, motivation, and I'm sure everyone on the call understands all of the benefits. But I think being really clear for an organisation, and those benefits transcend across small to large. I appreciate that for different size organisations and different organisations, there's different challenges. But I think my experience and my observation, so if you're clear on the why will drive you to where you need to get to. And so that whole idea about, what we've seen in that gender pay gap, we have part of the Champions for Change work that we do. So it is a criteria that organisations must report their gender pay gap. Now that's taken some time to get to that, and people are doing that in different ways, but the 60 organisations that we work with are committed to reporting their gender pay gap. And what that does, and I'm sure he won't mind, but I know that when Contact Energy did theirs, and look, it wasn't a great figure, and I don't need to quote it here, but what the Chief Executive Mike did say is, now that's our starting place, now we need to. That's what holds them accountable, but that is really the starting of their journey, or the starting of the story. We've got that. It's the same with pay transparency. It's like, where's this? There needs to be a starting place for organisations. My other kind of observation around the work that we've done, particularly around the gender pay gap, is the idea or the collaboration. People learn from each other. So it takes away some of the unknown, particularly for those that are kind of have been on that journey for a little while. So I think that idea of coming together and sharing what we know and what we don't know has been a real catalyst for undoing, whether it's some of the fear or the unknown. So that would be my kind of other observation in terms of the work that we do with these organisations. Look, just as a Māori wahine, my own kind of lived experience about pay transparency, and this is an observation and not a criticism of the tertiary sector, but being able to understand my own value and my own worth. So having, 10 years ago, the opportunity to understand what that looked like in terms of like for like or similar to similar would have been, and it's been talked about, and we know, I would never have the courage to kind of, talk about a promotion or talk about a wage increase. And so that would have enabled me, I would have at least had some tools or some information or some places to really launch that conversation from with confidence. And so I think that, that pay transparency is, I have my own stories all the way through my career, never knowing what my value was, never being able to really measure my expertise, my experience, and the value I brought, particularly as a Māori, to work where they were trying to advance Māori and Pacifica. So I think those, and that would be not just for Māori and Pacifica, but that's my own lived experience. And it's interesting, as you get further along, of course you get more confident and you start questioning yourself. Am I being paid what I'm worth? Not am I being paid necessarily equal, but am I being paid what I'm worth? And do I feel valued? Anyway, I did have my timer on, so I have done my 8 minutes, Andre, thank you. And I look forward to listening to the other speakers and then engaging with a really rich kind of kōrero. Thank you.
Ngā mihi kia koe, Agnes, thank you so much for that really short but really rich kōrero that you've given us today. A couple of things that I've taken away from that is that, at one point in New Zealand society, there was this idea that we couldn't do something, we couldn't do things around te tiriti. And I think you're showing us that actually this is one of those sort of myths that we need to challenge, that in fact we can implement pay transparency legislation. We can make sure that workers are paid rightly and fairly for the work that they do, and that the colour of their skin or their ethnicity or their gender should not be a barrier to that. And the other thing I also take from you is that how can we also give confidence to our people who have lived experience, whether it's Ngāti Whenua, Māori, Pacific, Asian, or other people that may feel that they can't advocate in their workplaces, how can we arm them with the tools as well on a personal level, in addition to this legislative change that we need to see? So thank you very much, Agnes, for your wonderful work that you do in your sphere. Thank you for the advocacy, the support, and adding your voice to making sure that there's more equitable and fair conditions for all people in Aotearoa. Laulala. We're now going over to our next speaker, who is I'm sorry about that. Our next speaker is actually Fuimaono. Jennifer Laulala, who's a mother of 2 young adult children. She's extremely passionate about equitable outcomes for Pasifika communities, and especially advancing women's issues in the workplace. She presented a submission before the Education and Workforce Select Committee on strengthening the amendments to the equal pay legislation and speaking on the many barriers that Pasifika women in the workplace face. She was actively also involved in the campaign for the Domestic Violence Victims Protection Act, which is an issue that's very close to her heart, also being a victim of domestic violence herself. And Fuimaono vows to continue her advocacy for all women to find their voice, to use their voice, and to become effective and never lose hope. So we'll hand over to you now, please, Fuimaono.
Oh, whawhai, Andre. E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā karanga rangamaha, tēnā koutou. Tēnā koe ki te whare, ata a hua nei, ki te marae, ki waho, tēnā kōrua. Ka mihi ki a koutou, ka mihi atu ki a ka rangatira, ka mihi atu ki a kuia, ka mihi atu ki te whānau o te rangi. Ka mihi atu ki te whānau o te whenua. Kia ora, everyone. So thank you very much, Andre, for listing out what was about. I'm a bit like, oh gosh, but you know, it's a bit strange. Like I've never done this before, talking to a computer screen, but I hope everyone's listening and can see me and hear me. So you know, I was sitting here listening to Agnes's kōrero, you know, as the CE for the Global Woman, and looking at the credentials of the people on this panel who are sitting with me, and I am in awe of all that you do, and also our listeners and the audience. Honestly, we have been working in this space far too long. We have done all the analysis. We have captured the data. We have the evidence. We know time and time again that Pasifika and Māori share the bottom of the pay scale. There is no denying that fact. That is evidence, and that's why we're here. What is clear is that there is no change. There's no future without change. There is no moving forward without coming together, whatever color of your skin, whoever you are in your workplace, wherever you are placed in Aotearoa, nothing's going to change unless we're really, really hop into this waka together. So I'm sitting here and I'm talking to you that change starts at the dinner table. It's as simple as that. It is really up to us. It's not up to them. It's not up to Saunoamaali'i. It's not up to Andre or the Human Rights Commission. We all have a role to play. And what I mean by it starts by having conversations on the dinner table to your whānau, to your family, to your children. The impact of this discrimination and the bias that continuously happens in Aotearoa, heavily affecting Pasifika and Māori, is diabolic. It's unfair. It's not right. And we are making this plea to the government of the day. They need to come through. This unfair treatment needs to stop. going home and not being able to cook a decent meal because you're worried about the power bill. That's not okay. And the compound effect of that, the mental health, your mental health comes into play. When you go home and you're not able to turn on the heater in your car going home, it's because you're worried that your petrol will be chewed up by turning on the heater in your car because you're not paid enough to put more petrol in the car. The compound effect of this discrimination against us is far too big than any of us. So it's about time that the data is there, the evidence is there. We're calling the government of the day to come through and make this a legislation so that we're holding agencies and organizations accountable to be transparent with their pay, to be transparent with everything that concerns human beings. It's a fundamental human right for people to be treated fairly. We're not asking much. We're not raising the bar high. No, we're asking them to value us who we are. Māori and Pacifica share the bottom of the pay scale at the moment. Māori, they are a treaty partner. They are a treaty partner. How does that work? How does that work? That they're still fighting to this day. And now Pacifica has joined the fight. So I'm making a plea to our Pākehā comrades who are on this call. The conversation starts with us, starting it with our families, sharing it with our nieces and nephews, because I'm here making a plea for my daughter, because already she is facing discrimination in the corporate world, and that's not okay. So as long as I'm alive, I'm going to continue to join the fight. And what that looks like from this day forward is like continuously having conversations with whoever, on the train, in the bus, in your car, in the lunchroom of your organizations, talking to managers. If there are managers on this call, I plea you, I make a plea with you, please continue to have this kōrero, allow your workers to have this conversation. Because I've been in jobs where I'm the only brown one in the team, and it was up to me to have that conversation, whether they wanted to listen or not, whether they were interested or not, I don't care. I was going to have the conversation anyway, just for awareness, so that they know, so that they learn. And then they start talking about it wherever they go. So if there are managers on this call, please, you have a responsibility to play. You have a responsibility to hold your authorities in whatever organization you are and tell them it's not okay for Māori and Pacifica to be treated unfairly, for Māori and Pacifica to be the bottom of the pay scale, for Māori and Pacifica to fight for opportunities, because it's not just about pay, it's about opportunities, it's about barriers. It's about getting the money in your bank account, and it's not enough. So I'm here to fight for my daughter, to fight for all the wahine toa, for my nieces, for my whānau, and for my families, that we all can create traction. We all can create change. We all can make movement. And it's up to you who can hear the sound of my voice to make that traction exactly where you are. Continue those conversations and continue to call out wherever you are, and never, ever, ever be afraid. Remember, it's up to us to change the course of history, and we're not here by accident. We're here, we're not leaving, we're not going anywhere. We're here to make a change. We're here to make a call, and together we are united, and we can create good change for the future. Haftai, everyone.
Haftai, tēnā lava Fuimaono. Fuimaono, I used to be a pastor, and I have to say that rousing challenge to us, I just feel like saying amen, amen, and amen. So thank you for that really invigorating and passion challenge to us. And there's three things that I took from your kōrero today. Number one, acknowledging that, yes, we Pacific people and other ethnic groups join the unfortunate, preventable, man-made pay gap alongside an adjunct to Tangata Whenua Māori, who are a tiriti partner. So I want to acknowledge that. Secondly, the challenge that you see that this belongs to all of us, not just the job of the Saunoamaali'i, the Equal Opportunities Commissioner. Everyone has a role. And then the third one that you raised for us, pertinent to that, is that actually the role of allyship. So if you're here right now and you perhaps don't belong to one of these cohorts, who are Pacific, who are Māori, who are ethnic, who are women, we ask you to do your role. And we saw a powerful example of allyship on the weekend. We ask you to do the same thing as well. Please, we need your help to do this. We have agency, we have mana on our own, but we need your support. Get this message out at your homes, on the train, in your public transport, everywhere you go. Get people to sign our letter and make sure that this issue stays front of mind for all of us, because the positive impact of addressing these pay gaps is that we can remove those compounding, discriminatory inequality. We can remove all of that as we address this pay legislation ask that we're asking of government now. It's now my privilege to hand over to our next speaker, who is Lynette Reid. And Lynette has had a stellar career in recruitment and organisational development. She's the former head of diversity, equity and inclusion at Auckland Transport, and she pioneered that organisation's very first Pacifica strategy, as well as overseeing the future of work, hybrid ways of working strategy as well. And she's also a founding member and chair of the host of the Viaduct Village, an informal and growing network of Pacifica corporate leaders in Tamaki Makaurau. And she's now head of DE&I at the Auckland Council, and is the founder of the corporate consultancy Hybridges. Most private and public sector organisations struggle to attract and retain Pacifica people, and her organisation aims to close that gap via cultural intelligence consulting. So we'll hand over to you now, please, Lynette. Laulala.
Talofa lava, ma lava soifua maua, ma langi ma, whaatalofa tule ni taiao, whaatai lava moleava noa. So it's warm Pacifica greetings to you all. It's an absolute joy and really humbled and quite an honour to be sitting on this panel alongside amazing allies and champions as well. But as I think my peer Agnes so rightfully rightfully did this morning, I would like to honour the team at Human Rights Commission, especially our champion Saunoamaali'i, and all of the team that make and drive this very important piece of work. And it really is very timely, and especially what is actually happening across a lot of corporates. So Andre whaatai lava for the introduction, very humbling as well. So I think from my perspective is I am a Pacifica human resources practitioner. I am very used to growing up in quite a minority group and being very lonely and looking around thinking, you know, where are my people? So, and with HR practices, there comes policies, and there's systemic procedures, and sometimes even systems that perhaps are not fit for purpose for our Pacifica rangatahi, and every likes from all across the organisation. So I really am humbling and also quite direct in terms of calling on all the employers who perhaps are sitting here today, even on the panel, or you might actually be reading or seeing this video recording at a later time, that if you are making the decision or perhaps haven't made the decision to be transparent around your pay, that I do encourage you to do so. There are lots of benefits around from a people perspective, but not only that, I think one of the most important things, which is really about allyship, is that we are sharing the accountability. So it's shared accountability in terms of, and really it's the call today for our government to bring transparency and make this and normalize this across our beautiful country. So, you know, as Pacifica, and even as an individual Pacifica, I've sat in head of recruitment roles. So I've been able to make some of those changes and influence some of those systemic. And we always, perhaps many times in corporates and big corporates, we tend to blame the system, and we say, look, it's not part of our process. There's an approval process, so you have to. And you're absolutely right. It does actually exist in big corporates. However, I do want to challenge and actually say that we are the system. We have the power, and we have the absolute, especially for those who are in senior leadership roles, that we actually have the influence and are able to even bring some of those systemic changes. And it's a passion of mine to be able to go into corporates, even as my own consultancy business and my day jobs, that I am able to influence and bring some of those changes and speak to leaders and find those champions in organizations that have the same value. And whether you're Pacifica or from a different ethnicity or background, we all have a duty of care to be able to bring transparency across. So for me, it really is Pacifica people enter through the doors of recruitment. So you are invited to enter those doors, and being invited for an interview is quite daunting for Pacifica. We have cultural nuances that perhaps don't fit most of our corporate Western structures, and a lot of our corporates are built on Western models. And those Western models don't necessarily fit the way that perhaps even I grew up. And from a very young person entering the corporate doors in my early stages of my career, I really struggled to, and even things like eye contact, making that eye contact with the interviewer and sitting across a table where the power really laid and was very much dominated on one side of the table. So to be able to bring some of those policies and bring some of those practices through really tangible, looking at recruitment practices, how you're running recruitment, looking at those leadership programs, where are those biases, presenting data across the business, having an agenda on the board report, having an agenda and being visible from an executive leadership team, really tangible ways. I'm being quite tactical in what my 8 minutes, but I think it's really, it is really relevant to actually say that perhaps the operating models are just not fit for purpose in terms of bringing some of those systemic change. And I'm sure there's an opportunity. I know there is an opportunity on the run sheet to be able to go a little bit deep and dive a little bit deeper in terms of the how. But I think it's really important that we talk about the what. What does it mean to be able to bring pay transparency across a corporate structure that is big as Titanic? What does it mean to be able to change some of those languages? And what does it mean to be able to bring in and influence some of the inclusiveness and being able to bring in a sense of belonging? So what do we need to look at? So I'm calling upon all the employers and even corporates that perhaps have not or have not made that decision to bring transparency. One, I think retention. There is a talent war, and look, this is not just in New Zealand, but from a global perspective, people are fighting for the same talent, especially in a small country like New Zealand versus any other corporate or global country that we live in. So in order to retain your people, you need to start looking at those particular practices. So for me, it's the commitment across working groups internally to be able to bring data and contextualizing those data, finding those areas of representation, and then saying, look, does this fit for purpose in terms of our value propositions and our people propositions? Does that align? And if it doesn't align, what are some of those things that we can make those changes to? I'm really passionate. My parents left Samoa, Salik Moa and Nelva'a in the very early 70s, like most New Zealand born New Zealanders. So I'm a first generation New Zealander, very proud, grew up in Australia. So I was very used to, it's become normal for me to become sort of the, oh, look, I don't see my people here. However, that excuse of, oh, look, there's only one particular Pacifica person. So what can we do to elevate? What can we do to usher? And what can we do to fill those spaces that need to be filled so that we get to reflect the richness of our beautiful country? So I'm really looking forward to hearing all of the rest of my colleagues and my esteemed panelists as well. So thank you so much for the opportunity. And yeah, let's think a little bit different in terms of what our practices and operating models are.
Talofa lava whawhitai, Lynette, for that wonderful, compelling challenge that you bring to us as well. And what I take from that is actually we often blame this idea of the system out there, but actually you've reminded us that we are the system. The system actually starts with us, and it starts with individual best practice. And, you know, businesses pride themselves on innovation and setting new trends. And this is an excellent place to be able to do that, particularly in terms of today's labour market, but then also with due respect to the human rights obligations and responsibilities that businesses and corporates have. We've had a number of employers and businesses that have already signed up to our open letter. So this is a call also for other organisations to add to that, add your logo to that as well. And the other point I take from you, Lynette, is actually the assumptions that we make around the system are not just working for people affected by the Pacific pay gap, but more generally. These actually don't work for a number of groups. So when we get it right for some of the groups we're talking about today, we actually get it right for everyone. So thanks for your great work that you do in your community, and not only in your consultancy, and not only in your professional role, but also in your community as well. Mano lava. At this point, just before we hand over to our last speaker, I just want to give a bit of an ad, just for the couple of things happening. Number one, in your comment section, you will see that we have the open letter on our Action Station website available right now. So please make sure without delay that you sign up to that and you send that link around also. And then also today is Talanoa. It's going two ways. It's a kōrero. It's not just from us. We also want you to engage in this conversation today as well. So there's a Q&A section or a tab there. So please write your questions into the Q&A section. And then what we will do is and then upvote one if a question is in the chat that you see that you resonate with or you want the answer to. And then the ones that are upvoted, Saunoamaali'i will add that as she's convening our panel. So on to our last speaker before we go into our Q&A today. It's my privilege to introduce Nina Santos. And Nina is a first-generation migrant from the Philippines. She is passionate about intersectional gender equity and the rights of women, migrants, and communities. And she's the delivery manager for Mind Migrants and Ethnic Communities. She's the delivery manager for Mind the Gap, an alliance-backed campaign for pay transparency and ethnic and gender pay gaps in Aotearoa as well. And she's a writer and a staunch spokesperson, and she sits on the board of the National Council of Women and regularly commentates on women's issues. She is a Young New Zealander of the Year, semi-finalist, Kiwi Bank Local Hero Medalist, and has been named YWMCA's group of trailblazing women under 25 to watch and Asia Foundation's 25 to watch also. It's so wonderful. I can't wait as well to be able to qualify for the under 25. I think that time's passed, sorry about that. But anyway, we'll go over to you now, Nina. Thank you very much.
Yeah, ora Andre, thank you so much for that really flattering introduction. I always cringe when I read my own bio, just that strong hit of imposter syndrome coming over me. Kia ora to everyone on the webinar. I also want to acknowledge Saunoamaali'i and the rest of the Pacific Pay Gap campaign team, who are strong allies at Mind the Gap. So I've been delivery manager of Mind the Gap since the campaign launched about 1.5 years ago. And we're also campaigning for pay transparency, particularly what I like to say, a specific type of the specific piece of the pay transparency buffet, which is mandatory pay gap reporting. But today, the perspective I really want to highlight is my lived experiences as a young woman growing up in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and as a migrant of color. My family moved here from the Philippines when I was 13 years old. So nearly 10 years ago now. And I'm quite new to the pay equity space. And so I always say I stand on the shoulder of giants and people like Saunoamaali'i who have been campaigning for decades. And this change is just long, long overdue. And what I have learned in the last 1.5 years of campaigning is that I am and will always feel like the other as an Asian woman. So when I was a kid, every time I'd fill in a form at the airport, my ethnicity, Filipino, or even Asian more widely, wouldn't be part of the classifications. It'd be what I call the main ones, the mainstream ethnicities, and then other at the end. So, you know, over the years, I've gotten used to ticking that other box. As I'm, you know, through the course of campaigning for Mind the Gap, I have found myself giving media commentary, for example, and always, you know, being vocal about the need to be an intersectional approach to closing pay gaps. You know, pulling in the intersectionality of race and how Maori, Pacifica, and Asian women have much bigger pay gaps than Pakeha women. And one time, a friend at university came up to me and said, "Love her." But this comment has always stuck at the back of my head. She asked me, "Nina, don't you ever feel guilty for advocating for the Asian pay gap or the migrant pay gap? Because, you know, Maori and Pacifica women have been here for ages. They're indigenous to the land. They face much greater social inequities than migrants." And to me, that just made me feel really tone deaf, because in my work, I have never once aimed to take away space from Maori or Pacifica women. I acknowledge that Pacifica women are the lowest paid group in Aotearoa. They bear the brunt of the pay gap. So when I advocate for better outcomes for Asian women and migrants, to face the resistance and the competition myth, it's just kind of, it's hurtful. It always kind of makes me feel guilty that, should I really be in this space? Should I really keep working the pay equity space because other people have it worse? And I wanted to start with a story because I wanted to touch on the competition myth and how the system of capitalism and, you know, really integrated inequality perpetuates this myth. So it pits us workers, it pits people of color against each other, when really we are advocating for the same thing. Like Saunoamaali'i said, we just want better outcomes. We want livable incomes for our family. We don't want our children to starve. We're all on the same boat. We're all in the same waka. So I'm going to quickly shut down that myth. And what that story really touches on is the invisibility and the plight of anti-Asian racism and discrimination. Yes, I understand that, you know, sorry, the thing I want to point out is that there's always space for everyone to be advocating for their own issues. And we don't need to be taking away from others to push forward better outcomes for Asian communities. Pay gap reporting and pay transparency as a whole, what it does is it lifts the burden of people of color and migrants who we know face, you know, precarious working conditions. It lifts the burden of us and onto the employer. Employers should be the one being held accountable, and the burden should be on them to measure and address their pay gaps. It shouldn't be up to employers who don't have the bargaining power in workplaces to ask and inquire about them. As a woman of color, I know how hard it is to talk about pay. My parents, when we first arrived here, just like most migrants, had to start from scratch. And when you don't have that bargaining power to negotiate your pay or inquire about whether you're getting paid equally or fairly compared to your other Pakeha co-workers, you just settle. And there's a phenomenon I like to call the grateful migrant effect, where migrants are made to feel like they should settle for the absolute bare minimum because they've traditionally had less in their motherland, so where we're from. And I just detest that idea so much, because that gives way for more exploitation. That gives way for employers to keep paying their employees unfairly. Sorry, my timer's just stopped, Andre, so feel free to cut me off anytime. With Mind the Gap. Oh, okay. So with Mind the Gap, we launched a pay gap registry a year ago. So International Women's Day this time last year. And what we've done is convince businesses to voluntarily sign up and report their pay gaps on our public pay gap registry. Sorry, I'm just being told to flip my my background, so I've done it now. So at the start of the campaign, there were only a handful of businesses who were voluntarily reporting their pay gaps, and now we're close to 100, which is great news. Like I said, the employers, the burden of pay gap reporting should be on employers. However, it's not. We need the government to step in and actually legislate for the change, for the wave of change to carry through, because the voluntary aspect isn't strong enough to encourage the business sector. It's great that we now have nearly 100 people in the registry, but we really need action from the government, and which is why I have always backed the campaign of the Human Rights Commission demanding for pay transparency, because it really is the start. Pay inequality and pay equity issues will take more than a generation to fix, but without the basic transparency, we're going to struggle with uncovering the actual discrimination and the racism and the sexism that enables these pay gaps to thrive. And that's what it does. It, like Agnes said earlier, it will really shine a light on the discriminatory and racist practices of workplaces. I'm quite idealistic, must be the Gen Z in me, but I like to think that no organizations set out to have pay gaps, but they're there. Racism, being, because Aotearoa New Zealand is built on the culture, literally foundations of colonial violence, racism is part of our DNA. So pay gaps, as a manifestation of this colonial and racial capitalism, will persist until we have that transparency, and then businesses take, action to actually address what's causing their pay gaps. How much time do I have? Andre, again, feel free to stop me. I feel like I've rambled on. So what I really want to echo today is that when we talk about pay gaps, it's a whole lot of stats, or stats infographics at Mind the Gap always go viral. But what we often forget is that there's real people behind the stats. So stats may be abstract, but the hardship people are facing isn't. My dad works for the union space, so I've been really lucky to be involved in the union movement as well, which is why I feel so strongly about the cause. And the discrimination and hardship faced by a lot of Filipino migrants, a lot of Filipino builders, construction workers, trade workers, and other laborers, is just appalling. And it's invisible. The racism and discrimination they face will remain invisible until we introduce, new pay transparency legislation and actually put the burden on employers to confront it. I think that's the key word for today, really, just today and every day, confronting. That's what all businesses need to do to their pay gaps, and that's what the government needs to do with this issue.
Mawhaftai te lava, Nina, for your wonderful contribution to this kōrero as well. A statement that resonates with me that you were saying today is that this is derivative of a sort of capitalist society and assumptions that we make, and that we're in this place and we don't need to be in competition with each other. That's actually a distracting narrative, and that actually equality and equity can be achieved and not at the expense of other people. So thank you very much for that rich kōrero. And the other thing I also took from you is the ethnic intersection as well. This not only affects women, though most acutely it absolutely does, but also affects some of our tāne as well, such as Asian men, Pacific men, and also Māori men and others as well. So this is why it's vital that we do address this pay gap by way of introducing or asking the government to really introduce this pay transparency legislation. Just before I hand over back to the Commissioner to convene our Q&A, just want to acknowledge all those that are on the call today. We have other commissioners here from the Commission who have joined in. We have MPs online and lots of civil society and community leaders and people who have signed up to our letter already by organisations. So I can see all your names there and just really appreciate your support today. And in the chat as well, don't forget that we've got Q&A as well as the link to the open letter, which I encourage you to sign it actually before the end of our session today. I'll now hand over to Saunoamaali'i. Thank you.
Wow, very, very powerful words, powerful women. So thank you very much to our panel for, for your statements and the constant encouragement to our participants on the webinar to act and to spread the word to the networks. I'll start with some questions. We've got some questions here already that have popped up, but I wondered if there was a question that was sent to us prior to the webinar of people who couldn't come. And I wonder if I could direct this one to Agnes and Lynette in terms of, some ideas of how can we support small businesses, say the ones that would maybe only just have 5 or 10 people, in terms of the pay transparency, our pay transparency mechanism. What are some of the perhaps some hints that you could offer to our audience in terms of trying to help those small entities to get with the cause, basically?
I'll pitch in first, Lynette, if you don't mind. Look, I think if I go back to my original thing, big, small, or large, the idea about the why, and this is a long journey, this is not a short one.
Yeah.
If we don't address that, at some point they'll lose their talent. I do get the risk. So I think, I was thinking as I was listening, what's a role that we could kind of all play together in terms of some kind of tools that help them understand and how to get there, and not so much the benefits or the risks, but making sure that people understand this is a journey that we need to take. And at some point, if you don't do this, that talent is going. I just wanted to make one other observation. It's really interesting that, when we're recruiting people, we're more transparent, because when we're wanting a job, we ask what the money is. And it's interesting that we do that at that front end, but we're not prepared to do that in retaining our team. But anyway, that would be my short. Lynette.
I love it. Yeah, I absolutely agree, Agnes. I think there's power in co-design. And from a Pacifica perspective, we bring a village mentality to a lot of the corporate spaces or businesses or teams. And regardless of the size of the organization, having a say or being at the table to be able to co-design how you are rewarded, how you are remunerated, how you are, pretty much for the time, you will gain so much more in terms of engagement, being able, a space where innovation is welcomed, and a lot more higher. I think the fact that you've got you bring in all of yourself. We hear this so much in corporate, and some of the small businesses say, you bring all of yourself to work. But in most cases, we compartmentalize our lives. So we have, I've got Lynette at work, I've got Lynette at the whaletua end, I've got Lynette at, the preschool side, I've got Lynette at the shopping, and then all of a sudden it's, I've got Lynette as a wife. And so the fact that you create spaces for your people in a small or a large organization, that is power of inclusion. And that enables people to bring their amazing ideas. The fact that we're project managers when a family member dies, the fact that, it's automatic. So I think there's power in bringing all of that. And that, to me, mitigates all of the risk and those restrictiveness of pay transparencies on small businesses as well.
The only other thing I'd like to add, I've just been reading some of the work that Dr. Paul Spoonley's been doing from Massey in terms of the demographics that we're about to face into. So, there's going to be no choice about what we do around this, because the talent coming forward and the big potential opportunity for that talent will require us to co-design, to co-think, to be transparent. This notion about secrecy is kind of it's an interesting kind of thing, we would want to make those things a secret, and I get the rationale for all of that, but just the notion of secrecy kind of doesn't run with the theme of business. Businesses should be about transparency, for sure. Kāhui.
Yeah, Kāhui, thank you. Nina and Fuimaono, do you have a view on that? Like, do you, what we know from overseas is that pay transparency legislation commonly targets businesses, say 100 staff up. Certainly from a human rights perspective, the Human Rights Act, our Human Rights Act, makes it unlawful to discriminate, basically. And that right to be free from discrimination belongs to everybody, regardless of the size of the business that you work for. So, what you said, Agnes, and what you said, Lynette, we're about being inclusive. We're about lifting all of our talent up. And, there's no point in starting off with pay transparency legislation where you immediately exclude people. It kind of defeats the whole purpose of, the whole point of, of freedom and lifting the secrecy is that we all benefit, especially our most vulnerable. So, but I'm just wondering, Nina and Fuimaono, if you had a view in terms of, and I'm thinking, some of our businesses that are owned by, say, our recent migrants or our settler groups are small businesses. So any insights you've got there? I mean, there could be Pacific businesses, it could be, businesses run by, say a Chinese, anyone from our migrant communities. Any insights from Mono and Nina that you could contribute in terms of how we can support them? We've heard about the co-design as well. So any additional thoughts on how we could support those small businesses?
Fuimaono, I'm happy to go after you.
Right, I'm trying to unmute. Yeah, like co-design, that's I'm trying to connect. I'm always one to, how do we kind of like bring it home, and what does that mean to me and my whānau, right? What does that mean to me and my whānau if I'm not a business person, if I'm not in the corporate space? Now, I remember Lynette was talking about co-design. Yeah, exactly. And I heard Agnes and Lynette also talk about something to do with influence, sitting on those tables and where decisions are being made and influencing those decisions. The thing is, like, that notion as well as having a seat at the table and influencing those decisions is, sometimes the notion is there's like to brown the table where decisions are being made. Now, sometimes there are people on that table who are Māori and Pacifica descent, actually don't take the opportunity and responsibility to speak for our own people. Now, my point there is, if you are here on this webinar and you sit on those tables, don't just warm the seat, break the seat if you have to. Honestly, break the seat if you have to. If you are in a position of privilege and you have the opportunity to speak for those who are unable to have a voice, say it, speak it. Think of your whānau. Think of your whānau. Now, I don't know if this answers your question, Saunoamaali'i, because I'm always trying to bring it back to what it means for a Pacifica person, for a Māori wahine who goes home. This legislation, if anything, of course, will hold these business people to account, but how can we support them? I think education is one of them. Now, why I say that is because recently I spoke to someone who was working in corporate, and when I say corporate, the person is right up there on the ladder as a partner in a corporate firm. To my surprise, I had a very energizing and invigorating conversation with her, all about her tautoko and her support of Māori and Pacifica and people who are being undervalued and underpaid at the moment in the corporate space. To my surprise, I had to repeat myself because she wasn't answering the question. The thing that came through from that kōrero is that, I don't know, disregard or being unaware. So it's we're sitting here having this kōrero, we're talking about businesses, but sometimes there is a disconnect somehow. So business owners maybe need to be educated to be supportive of this legislation, see the benefits of supporting this legislation and how it can help our own people. I don't know if that answers the question, Saunoamaali'i, but I'm just trying to make that connection, you know, with us and, you know, and that business world. But I see that education as the key as well, because I've spoken to people in, gosh, partners and professional firms, and to my surprise, and it was, to me, I was just standing there and was like, seriously, how can you not hear? How can you not see? How can you not feel? When the color of your skin is being affected and influenced, when the color of your skin is being underpaid. So it's like our very own are up there, but sometimes they turned a blind eye or just oblivious or not being aware of what's happening. So I hope one of those people, when I say one of the, like the professional services firms and all those corporates are here, you have a role to play. Whether you're Māori, Pacifica, Pākehā, Asians, go back and hold that table to account. Hold everyone on that table who is sitting on that seat, and honestly break the seat if you have to make the world move to support this kaupapa. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, malo saunoa Fuimaono, and break the seat in a constructive way. You know.
Yes. Sorry, I didn't mean just physically hold the seat. No, I
hear you.
I was basically saying, like, don't just warm the seat, break the seat if you need to make traction in a, you know, in a mountain moving way with your voice, but not physically fight. No, I mean break the seat. Sorry, I didn't make that clear.
Malo saunoa Fuimaono. Nina, what are your thoughts in terms of how we can support some of our small businesses, especially I'm thinking about the businesses that are owned by, you know, Don Pākehā, governors.
Yes. So I want to acknowledge what Agnes and Fuimaono have actually said. I echo that idea. For example, on the pay gap registry, the criteria we set for businesses to voluntarily sign up was 50 or more staff. And again, this is the problem with the government's inaction. There's no single methodology for calculating pay gap. So businesses are kind of just doing what they can. And these are the good ones who actually like want to take initiative. The rest, silent. But there are exceptions. We have found that there are some small businesses with less than 50 staff. We have a business on the registry reporting with only 10 staff. So the barrier that we initially thought was if they had less than 50 staff, we'd risk disclosing everyone's salaries. From my perspective, that wasn't such a bad idea because, you know, transparency just helps everyone. But there are already small businesses who are doing this, which to me proves that it's not impossible. So I agree, we really need to push the government to step up and co-design a methodology that works for small businesses in a way that helps their workers.
Yeah, salamat. You know, it's like Agnes said, if we're clear on the why, we're bound to find a way. I mean, when COVID hit us, we found a way overnight to distribute tens of billions of dollars. You know, it was not a problem. So I'm sure we can find a solution to this.
Exactly.
There's a question that often comes up when people are saying, isn't it illegal to ask for people to disclose their ethnicity, you know, or ask for those sort of those characteristics? So can I come to you, Agnes and Lynette? What is your response to that perception that you can't ask for these things, and therefore how can you ever measure the ethnic pay gap, etc., and isn't it illegal? So over to you, Agnes. Perhaps come to you, Agnes, first.
Sure. Really interesting. We've just run a, so just so you know, we work with the organisations both at a chief executive level and in a people's level. And we've just run what we call a masterclass around ethnic data and the collected. And that was kind of led by Spark. And so the response from our organisations is really, we need to understand we need to see what that gap is. And it is a bit like, I think what Nina said, it's the responsibility of the organisations to figure out how they collect, and Māori and Pacific and others are more likely to respond to owning who their thing. So we've over the last couple of years that I've been in this role at least, I think we started off, we had of the say 60, maybe only 20 being able to kind of report, and it's not perfect science yet, but we're getting there for some organisations, that ethnic data and what that pay gap is. So again, a bit like the pay transparency, it's important to know. You can't do anything about it. And so, you know, if anyone's interested, I'm really happy to connect you to the work that Spark is currently doing in terms of, so they've done a really deep dive about how they do that, you know, what are the messaging they send out, whether it's a staff survey or any of those things, to really start to capture authentic, meaningful, accurate data in terms of ethics. So no, same thing. That's the big why. The organisations that are leading in this space know that it's important to do. It's the right thing to do. Commercially, it's valuable to them. So they do find ways.
Yeah. Kia ora. Kia ora.
Yeah,
Lynette?
thank you. This is really quite a sensitive topic for some teams and organisations, but especially ethnic groups. And I think it does certainly go back to what gets measured actually brings change. So if the measurement isn't there, and then tie it back to Agnes's point, the why. You know, there's a lot of change fatigue around organizations. There's a lot of data fatigue as well. And I guess the follow-up of being really transparent around this sits on the board agenda, this topic sits on the executive leadership agenda, it sits on the senior leadership agenda, it sits on the leadership development agenda, and then it sits on that middle management, progressive, and right through to the emerging leaders, through to the whole coal face. So it is a shared responsibility in terms of being transparent, but most importantly, the follow-up of why I'm capturing your data. Why am I asking these questions? And most importantly, tying that back to strategy. That strategy has a time box. We will deliver this at this amount, and what are the consequences of not being able to deliver, and where does that accountability lie? So that's what we need to do, and that's what most of organizations are really committed to doing. Where I feel the and the blurred lines are, is it because the left hand and the right hand, and we know in big organizations, silos exist. So bringing that transparency enables those silos to be broken, smashed, a little bit like the break the seat comment, that Fuimaono, but done in a constructive and in a way that that holds everyone to account. And so you can see progress, and then people actually then start to voluntarily, you move it from a mandatory to a voluntarily. I want to be able to share some of that information because I know it helps build that strategy, because I can see traction.
My only other comment, just off the back of what Lynette's saying, you're right, it's got to be. So it does have to come from your governance, it has to come from your management, and that kind of will deplete those kind of silos. And again, I'd like to say that, you know, the work that I've seen, and there are others, but the work that I've seen Spark do, that's certainly what it's been driven from governance, it's driven from management, and people are really clear about the why, and they're really clear about what they need to be doing, what the systems people need to be doing, what the HR people need. They're really clear about their roles and responsibilities and their obligations to the cohort.
Absolutely. There's a question that's come from Natasha, and it's, you know, we're talking about pay gaps, but when we talk about pay transparency, it's more than just reporting the pay gaps. So essentially, Natasha talked about, you know, the issue that was discovered by staff around pay discrepancies. They took it to management, and basically management said, you're not supposed to know that because you're not allowed to talk about pay. I mean, this is one of the things that we're calling for in the pay transparency legislation, is to have clauses that remove these secrecy clauses. So you know, as Nina said, you know, take the onus off the workers and put it onto the employers to do the right thing and to abide by the law, basically. But Natasha, that's a quick answer to your question. It's one of the provisions that we wanted to have in the legislation, is to remove all of those secrecy clauses. Again, we can talk about privacy, but you know, the right to privacy also exists amongst other rights: the right to be free from discrimination, the right to gender equality, the right to equal employment opportunity, the right to adequate standard of living. we can't sacrifice that whole package of rights for one. And so this is the way we're looking at it in terms of pay transparency. Privacy is no longer the shield that's going to continue the secrecy. We need to lift it, but we need to do it in a sensitive way and respectful way. There was a question from that we've got 19 comments. The questions are going off, so we may not be able to answer everybody. But there was a question there from Paul in terms of what countries have pay transparency. Certainly we know in up in Norway, Sweden, Finland, everybody's individual pay is public knowledge. They've gone all out on transparency. Certainly Australia, they're very much pushing still about around pay transparency, but only on the characteristic of gender. What we're wanting in New Zealand is to include ethnicity. We also want disability to be included. We want basically alignment between the Human Rights Act and pay transparency. So that would make us different. And we also want to ensure that tiriti of Waitangi is core in legislation. You know, so we can't protect the rights of some people and not others. And that's a problem of the threshold. You know, if we're going to support the right to self-determination by tangata whenua, they are all included. All businesses where they work are included. So that would be the point of difference between us and these other countries, including different states in Canada and different states in the US who have legislated for transparency, including the requirement of all job ads to have the pay scale and so forth. So that's a short answer to your question, Paul. There was also a question from someone else in terms of what can we do from here? What's the plan? What's the campaign? You know, if we hand this letter over to government, what do we do after that? I'll come to the group. Any thoughts on how we can? We've heard about Mind the Gap, you know, so they're pushing their campaigning. And that's really, really important. So Nina said you've got about 100 employees. We've got thousands. We've got thousands of businesses that we want to get on board. So any hints from our group in terms of how can we keep this alive and actually thinking beyond the current government, whoever wants to be in government, how can we keep it alive in their eyes? So I'll go to Fuimaono, then we go to Nina, and then Lynette and Agnes.
Yeah, thanks, Saunoamaali'i. I think it really goes back to my comment that it's up to us to keep this alive. You know, and what that looks like is like it starts at home, starts at lunch place, you know, at your organizations, in the church groups, everywhere where we shall continue to have these conversations. Because when we take the onus on us, it's like it becomes you. It becomes, when I say it becomes you, it's embedded in you, that everything you do. And why I say that is like when I can't seem to shut up about this issue. You know, in the whānau gatherings, in the church gatherings, it's nothing to do with pay transparency, it's nothing to do with the ethnic pay gap. But here I am ramming on about, you know, how we have been continuously undervalued. So I think where to from here as well is like, continue to have this kōrero, continue to have the conversation. I have booked an appointment with my CE at my organization, handing him the report and asking him what he's doing to close this gender pay gap and not be afraid to have those conversations. You know, because at the end of the day, we are all people. No one is higher than the other, regardless of your titles. So have those difficult conversations, be bold and not be afraid to ask the hard questions. I'm prepared to have those conversations with, on my end, with LCE, with Human Resources, and I've started having conversations with our Women's Network at my agency that I worked on and asked what are they doing about this. So I've had someone contact me last week and they say they've done a report on diversity and inclusion and they're going to have to sit down with me so I go over it, and also the report about the ethnic pay gap in my agency, and all all that came to me because I was like hustling. Okay, what are you doing about this? Okay, what happened here? What happened here? So my point is like, it's really up to us to mobilize this conversation. It's really up to us to continue this awareness, because the more we talk about it, the more we refuse to be undermined and continue to be undermined. So, and that's my take on it. I always bring it back to me and what I do with it. And as an extension of myself, the immediate extension of myself is my 2 children, adult children, and they are having that conversation in their corporate spaces where they are. They are challenging their managers, they are challenging the leadership about where they sit within the pay scale, within the corporate spaces where they are. So that was an extension of me having those conversations at the dinner table. So my point is starting small, starting within your whare, cooking the kai, and watching TV, and asking about talking, normalizing those conversations, which I have with my 2 children. And I'm, proud to say that they are holding their leadership to account because of where they sit within the corporate space. Now, just quickly, like both my son and my daughter had a job offers from the corporate firm that they work for. They both got the roles. I came home and my 18-year-old daughter said to me, Mom, I want to negotiate my pay. And I said, oh, hallelujah, girl. And I said, you got it. And I said, you got the thinking. I love it. So the point that she came to me, I want to negotiate my pay because why is my brother getting more than I? And if I didn't have that conversation at home, they wouldn't have been aware. So I encourage and empower her. And I said, you go have that conversation, baby girl. You can't be my daughter and not have that conversation. So my point I want to stress here is like, it really starts at home, and then you build on that momentum outside of your whare, into the organizations, my goodness, and onto platforms wherever you go.
Laulala, I mean, the key message is our young people expect equity now. They expect equality. And it's a good thing that we've worked hard for them to expect that. So that is the expectations of our businesses. So how do we? So I'll go to you, Nina. How do we continue to put the pressure on government to legislate for pay transparency? So back to you, Nina, and on to Lynette and Agnes.
So I think there's a dichotomy here. It's really important to start at an individual level, especially those who have the privilege in workplaces to speak up, because again, it's not a coincidence that it's really hard for women and people of color to talk about pay. The capitalist system has imposed that so that workers can remain underpaid. But also it's really important, and I acknowledge what Anjum said in the chat, to keep highlighting this to government as a systemic issue. Pay inequity are modern day manifestations of ongoing colonial violence, ongoing racial capitalism. And often we're really focused on the, I appreciate Saunoamaali'i, how you have been really brave in calling out that the majority of the unexplained factors of the gap are because of bias and racism, because we tend to hide within safe terms like unexplained. Actually, it's not unexplained. We can explain it. And it's because of the embedded racism in workplaces. We need to keep, in our campaign messages, we really need to keep pushing the fact that we need systemic change. And the burden shouldn't be on individuals. It's not enough to be just brave. We need to dismantle the systems that keeps making us have to be, sorry, I'm losing my words here. We need to dismantle the systems that don't work for us. And in the meantime, while we do that, important for business owners and people with the privileges, usually Pakeha men and women, to stand up for their other people, for their other ethnic colleagues.
Yeah, salamat. Lynette?
Thank you. I'll be really brief because I feel like I've spoken a few points to this, but for me is set some really robust targets, and I'm not talking just in corporate, but even for yourself, having a goal and normalizing at your annual review. A lot of the disparities across organizations is due to leaders that are having out of cycle pay reviews. And then you've got this disparity that you've got these gaps that grow wider and wider. So have just be brave and have the conversation. Ask the questions, even at your team meetings. You know, what do we think about pay parity? Can we normalize speaking about pay parity? And did you know that this report, and even as a Pasifika woman, 75 cents to the dollar of the Pākehā or the Pālangi man, you know, that just does not sit well with me at all. So, and it doesn't normally sit well with a lot of my Pālangi colleagues as well. That's it. So find those allies and bring in a constructive way, but bring the data and bring the support and find those champions and have the conversations. Be brave. I think in order for us to change history, we can't keep doing the same thing over and over again. And so far it hasn't worked. So whakatau.
Malo whakatau. Over to you, Agnes.
Look, I'll probably comment, but I suppose thinking about, you know, when we talk about how do we use our privilege, I feel really privileged in this position. So I suppose from a global woman perspective, how do we mobilise those that we work with, whether those are chief executives, whether those are our members, and maybe that idea about pressure from all sorts of areas, including from business, to kind of do that. And also I was just thinking about, because there was originally a question about leadership. One of the things that we've been really intentional and mindful is to build into our leadership programs this idea about equity, about transparency, about equality, because the leaders that we are supporting as they go through, Māori, Pacifica and non, it's really important that it becomes a normal, it becomes something. It was interesting. We've just come off the back of our first module for Breakthrough Leaders in Waitangi, and it was really heartwarming to hear non-Māori and non-Pacifica talk about the unfairness. So I suppose what I think that we can do, I think I can do from my privileged position here, is to mobilise the people that we are here to both lead and serve.
He te pai. Yes, it's recognising our privilege and being brave, as you said, Lynette, and we all said. And sometimes it's easy for us to say, be brave, but when you're by yourself, it gets really hard. But I think it's really important in space to recognise that we're not by ourselves. There is this growing swell in our business and amongst our leaders. So thank you very much for that. I wanted to read out. So Steph has just reminded us, because there was that question about people worrying about the legality of asking, for ethnicity or perhaps the legality of doing something different. So Steph has just reminded us under Section 73 of the Human Rights Act, that provides the legal mandate for measures designed to assist in advancing peoples or groups that are discriminated against. In other words, there's already provision there that gives the okay for you to do something different if it's going to uplift the groups that you are finding are suffering from discrimination. So that's really important. Thank you very much for that reminder, Steph. We've got a question. We haven't heard much about the role of unions. We don't have, what should be the role of the unions in our campaign for pay transparency? And I'll open it up to anybody on the panel to jump in. I mean, certainly we've got a significant number of unions who have signed up in support of pay transparency. But I mean, is there something more that unions could be doing? We know, where's our sister Fuimaono? Oi, yeah. Apology, Fuimaono had to go. One of the things, for example, that came out of the Pacific Pay Inquiry from the Voices of Pacific Workers, that they would like the unions to consider when they're drafting collective agreements, that included in those collective agreements is the expectation for pay transparency to exist and for strategies to address at least gender and ethnic pay gaps. So that was one of the suggestions that came from the Pacific Pay Inquiry. So I thought I'll just drop that in. Does that make sense? I mean, Since Fuimaono talked about her children, I'll talk about my children. So one is on a collective contract that has no pay matrix, and it's a union negotiated contract. So clearly, we do need our unions to be being explicit about the expectations to ensure pay transparency happens for their workers. So I'll drop that in. Now, I'm really, really sorry, everybody. We've got so many chats and so many questions we haven't been able to cover, but the team here at the Human Rights Commission will endeavor to respond to the questions and send out responses to all our participants. So even if you didn't ask a question, you might be interested in the answer. So we will do our best to fulfill that. But I just want to say salamat, kia ora, whaftaitele to our panelists for being here and being brave and sharing your knowledge and being provocative. We need to be provocative right now. It's the perfect year to be provocative for obvious reasons. So whaftai lava, and God bless you all. And awesome. Please be safe, and we will continue to disrupt power. But for now, whaftai, and I'll hand it over to Brother Andre to sum up and to close us.
Okay. Whaftai te lava. Well, I've learned heaps today, and I've picked up a new saying, hashtag. I've heard of breaking the internet before, but today I heard about breaking the seat. And no longer will that conjure an image of someone eating too much at kōngai or kai after lunch. For me, now it will be redefined to mean don't just warm the seat, use your seat, use your influence to ask government to urgently introduce pay legislation, and whatever sphere of influence you have to demand and to facilitate change to close these preventable unnecessary gaps. Before I hand over to Lynette to close us off with Kakalo, I want to thank you all on behalf of the Equal Employment Opportunities Commissioner, Saunoamaali'i, to Kāhui Tika Tangata, the Human Rights Commission, and especially our dedicated staff who all work part-time, but very passionately on the specific pay gap, in addition to the other mahi. They are Rachna, Robin, Mani, Laura, Esther. We want to all thank you for joining our webinar, Zui Zono, today. And we please ask you in the chat, please immediately sign our Action Station page open letter and share it widely and passionately. As you have heard today, that for many minorities, raising legitimate questions about the issues we've talked about often have a discriminatory career limiting effect. That's the reality. In addition to psychosocial well-being impacts it does affect us and them upon groups already marginalized by the system and cultural business assumptions and norms. Therefore, we ask you, allies, we males, non-Māori, non-Pacific, non-ethnic, non-disabled, non-rainbow, your allyship is crucial at this time. Please keep this on top of mind, not only for government, but in our spheres of influence, whether at home, at the dinner table, or in our commutes, or at organizations. If you're at the decision-making table, let's normalize these conversations and facilitate the changes we must immediately see. Please, thank you for your support, and we thank you in advance for your continued support. I'll now hand over to Lynette to close us off, and then our team will get back to you. This webinar will be available online in due course, and also our team will get back with the questions raised in the Q&A. Whawhitai te lava.
Tato talo. Te mā whaatea oe Lynette tūlā, te le au maia le anganga matau ai, au le anganga le tua whaamalosi alofa mawhawhau ai. Father, we thank you for this talanoa. We thank you for the opportunity that we come before you and together, Lord, as a kaupapa, Lord, and we just declare, Father, for brave conversations to take place. Thank you that we are valued, the people that of great heritage, and we have a place, Lord God. We thank you, Father, for Saunoamaali'i and the Human Rights Commission and those that are leading the charge. And we thank you for the allyships. We thank you for this time. Bless everyone that's listening. We thank you in Jesus' wonderful name. Amen.
Erua o ocean.